Charlotte Whitmore burned her mother's letters on a Tuesday morning in July. Not because she wanted to forget, because she was about to walk into a stranger's house, and she refused to carry her mother's tenderness somewhere it would not be honored. She was 24 years old, educated, dignified, and worth exactly enough to cancel her father's debts. The man waiting for her signature was Nathaniel Blackwood, the wealthiest, coldest widower in all of Massachusetts. She had never met him. She didn't need to. If this story already has something pulling at your chest, you are not alone. Hit that subscribe button right now and drop the name of your city in the comments below. I want to see just how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to the morning that changed everything. Charlotte didn't cry when her father told her. She didn't cry, didn't plead, didn't make a sound. She simply turned away from him, walked to her mother's writing desk, pulled a drawer where she kept every letter her mother had left her before she died, and fed them, one by one, to the fire. Her father stood in the doorway. "Charlotte." She didn't answer. "Charlotte, please, you have to understand what I'm asking of you." "I understand perfectly, Father." She held the last letter over the flame without turning around. "You borrowed more than we had. The creditors are coming, and Nathaniel Blackwood has offered to make it disappear. He's a good man. People who know him say he hasn't smiled since his wife died 3 years ago." She let the letter go, watched it catch. "People say his last keeper left without giving notice. People say his home is as quiet as a church nobody visits." Thomas Whitmore stepped into the room. "That's gossip." "Maybe." She finally turned. "How much does he get for clearing our debts?" Her father couldn't hold her eyes. "Me," she said, still not a question. He pressed his lips together. "He needs a wife, someone to manage his household, attend social functions with him, present a respectable—" "He's buying respectability," Charlotte crossed her arms. "And he's buying it with me." "It isn't like that." "Then what is it like, Father?" Her voice never rose. It never did. That was always the particular thing about Charlotte Whitmore. She could break a man's heart with a quiet voice better than most women could with a scream. You walked into a man's study and said, "I have a daughter. She's educated. She's presentable. She won't cause you trouble." And he wrote a number on a piece of paper. And here we are. Thomas stared at the floor. "He asked to meet you first. He could have refused." "But he didn't." "No, he didn't." Charlotte breathed in slowly and let it out. "Then I suppose I should be grateful he found me acceptable." She moved past him toward the stairs. "He is not a cruel man," Thomas called after her. She paused on the first step, one hand on the banister, back still to him. "A kind man," she said quietly, "would not have agreed to this arrangement in the first place." She went upstairs to pack the only things she intended to keep. Nathaniel Blackwood was already there when Charlotte arrived at the lawyer's office. She had expected someone older, gray-haired perhaps, stooped under the weight of wealth and grief the way some men were. She had built a version of him in her mind over the 3 days between her father's confession and this morning, a version she could endure. He was nothing like it. He stood when she entered, as a man of his standing was expected to do. Tall, dark-haired, a face that had once been handsome and had since become something harder, something precisely controlled. His eyes moved to her once, a single, unrushed look, and then returned to the papers on the table as though she had already been catalogued and filed away. He did not extend his hand. He did not smile. "Miss Whitmore." "Mr. Blackwood?" He pulled out the chair across from him, not warmly, not coldly, the way a man pulls out a chair because it is what is done. Charlotte sat. Mr. Prescott, the lawyer, cleared his throat and began. "The terms are as follows. Mr. Blackwood will settle all outstanding debts held against the Whitmore estate, totaling $4,300, $4,412, Charlotte said. Both men looked at her. My father tends to round down when he's ashamed, she said evenly. The accurate figure is $4,412. I'd like the document to reflect that. A muscle moved in Nathaniel Blackwood's jaw. He looked at Prescott. Correct the figure, he said. Prescott scratched at the paper and continued. Charlotte read every line of the contract before she signed it. Every single clause, every provision, every carefully worded condition about her duties, her quarterly allowance, and the 2-year guarantee that her father could remain in the Whitmore house. The men waited. Neither rushed her. You read contracts, Nathaniel said, noting it. Only that. I read everything, Charlotte said. I find it reduces unpleasant surprises. When she finished, she looked up. There's no clause here, she said, regarding children. The room went very still. Nathaniel's expression didn't change. No, he said. There isn't. Is that something you... It is not a subject I intend to address in a lawyer's office. Charlotte held his gaze for a moment, then nodded and signed her name. He signed beneath it. She watched his handwriting. Precise. No flourish. The signature of a man who had long since stopped caring whether anyone found him interesting. As Prescott gathered the papers, Nathaniel stood and buttoned his coat. The ceremony will be Friday, he said. I'll arrange a carriage. I can arrange my own transportation, Mr. Blackwood. He paused. As you wish. He moved toward the door. Mr. Blackwood. He stopped. Didn't turn. I want to understand something before Friday. Charlotte kept her voice level, businesslike, the way she'd heard men speak when they wanted to be taken seriously in a room that had not yet decided whether to take them seriously. I understand the financial terms. I understand my duties. What I want to know is what you expect of me beyond the practical. He turned, slowly. I don't follow. Affection, she said. Companionship. Warmth in public. Warmth in private. The question, Mr. Blackwood, is what kind of marriage you actually want. Not the contract version. The honest one. He looked at her for a long moment, and she had the clear impression that no one had asked him a direct question in a very long time, and that he wasn't entirely sure whether to be insulted or surprised. I don't require your affection, Miss Whitmore, he said at last. Only your discretion and your compliance. Charlotte nodded once. Then we understand each other perfectly. She pulled on her gloves. I'll see you Friday, she said. The ceremony lasted 14 minutes. Charlotte counted. No flowers, no guests beyond her father and Nathaniel's lawyer. Pastor Hayes read the words quickly and without decoration. The way a man reads a passage he has read so many times, it no longer carries weight. When Hayes arrived at the end, he seemed to hesitate. His eyes moved between them once. Mr. Blackwood, he said carefully. You may... I know what comes next, Pastor. Nathaniel turned to Charlotte. His eyes held that same deliberate stillness they always did. He leaned forward and pressed his lips, cold, brief, precise, to her cheek. The way a man signs the bottom of a document. Charlotte did not flinch. She had expected nothing different. The carriage ride to Blackwood Estate took 2 hours. They sat across from each other and exchanged exactly 11 words. Charlotte counted those, too. She had learned early in life that when everything else was outside her control, the things she could count still belonged to her. 14 minutes, 11 words, $4,412. These were the measurements of her new life. She held them carefully. She had not expected warmth from Blackwood Estate, but she had not expected this particular kind of stillness either. The way the staff stood in a line near the entrance, straight and silent, like people who had learned not to be noticed. Like people for whom being noticed had not always ended well. Mrs. Hargrove stepped forward the moment Charlotte descended from the carriage. 60 or so, with sharp eyes and a spine like iron. She was the kind of woman who had spent a lifetime making difficult households function through sheer force of competence. Mrs. Blackwood. The title landed strangely. Charlotte let it. I'm Mrs. Hargrove. I oversee the household. It's a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Hargrove. I've prepared the east wing for your residence, per Mr. Blackwood's instructions. Charlotte glanced toward her husband. He was already at the door, already moving inside, already somewhere else entirely. Separate quarters, Charlotte said. Yes, ma'am. No judgment in it, only precision. Margaret has been assigned as your personal maid. A young girl, barely 17, stepped forward and dipped a quick curtsy. Charlotte smiled at her. The girl's eyes went wide, as though kindness was not something she encountered regularly in this house. Thank you, Margaret, Charlotte said. As they walked inside, Mrs. Hargrove lowered her voice. Dinner is at 7. Mr. Blackwood dines alone, as a rule. But given the circumstances, he's asked you to join him this evening. That was good of him. Mrs. Hargrove stopped walking. Ma'am. She turned and looked at Charlotte directly. I want to say something to you that perhaps isn't my place. Then say it. There are parts of this house that Mr. Blackwood keeps locked. Her eyes were very steady. The east corridor on the second floor. The music room at the end of it. They have been locked for 3 years. A pause. For good reason. You'd do well to leave them that way. Charlotte held her gaze. What reason? Mrs. Hargrove began walking again. His reasons, she said. And that was the end of that. Dinner was an education. Nathaniel Blackwood sat at the head of a table long enough to seat 20 people, and managed to make the silence feel entirely intentional. Like a man who had grown so accustomed to eating alone that the presence of another person was an inconvenience he had decided in advance to minimize. Charlotte sat to his right. She lasted 7 minutes. How long have you lived in this house? She asked. He looked up from his plate. 12 years. Did you grow up here? No. Was it your wife's family's home? Something shifted in his face. Not pain exactly. Something more controlled than pain. The expression of a man who has learned to get ahead of his own feelings before they can catch him. No, he said. I bought it. Before the marriage or after? Before. She nodded slowly. So you built a life here first, then tried to fit a marriage into it. He set down his fork. Mrs. Blackwood, he said, in the tone of a man measuring each word before he commits to it. I appreciate that you are a woman who asks direct questions. I want to assure you that I find that quality neither charming nor particularly aggravating. I simply note it. He picked his fork back up. But there are subjects I don't discuss at the dinner table. Is there a particular hour you're more open to conversation? There is not. Charlotte reached for her water glass. Then perhaps you might tell me what we are expected to talk about in public. At social functions, I imagine we'll be expected to seem as though we've met before. We'll manage. Will we? Mrs. Blackwood, Charlotte, she said. He looked at her. My name is Charlotte, she said. If we're going to manage public appearances together, you might do well to practice saying it. The silence held. Then, quietly, with the careful deliberateness of a man touching something he hadn't decided was safe. Charlotte. There, she said. That wasn't terrible. He said nothing for the rest of the meal. But he didn't leave the table early either. She noted that, too. That night, Charlotte sat in the East Wing bedroom, her room, in a house that was not her home. And she made herself a promise. She would not break. She had not come here to break. She had come here because her father needed saving, and she was the only one who could do it. That was the truth of it, plain and unromantic, and she had looked at it square and agreed to it. She would do her duties. She would be civil. She would find something useful to do with her days. And she would not spend her energy mourning a life she hadn't lost yet, only rearranged. She thought of her mother. She thought of the letters burning. And then she heard it, a low sound, moving through the walls of the house like something alive. She sat up straight, listened harder. Piano. Someone was playing the piano. The notes came carefully, unhurried. A slow, deliberate piece played by someone who knew it by heart, and still, somehow, played it like it cost them something. Like each note was being pulled out of a place that had been sealed shut. Charlotte stood, opened her door, stepped into the corridor. The music was clearer out here. She followed it down the east hallway, up to the second floor. The corridor Mrs. Hargrove had warned her about. The one she'd said not to come near. She stopped in front of the door at the end. The music kept going, low and searching. A question being asked over and over by someone who already knew the answer was going to hurt. She stood there with her hand a few inches from the door. She did not knock. She listened. And then, without warning, the music stopped. Silence fell like something physical. The door opened. Nathaniel Blackwood stood in the frame with his jacket gone, his cravat loose, and his hair, for the first time since she'd known him, slightly undone. His eyes moved from her face to the empty corridor behind her, confirming she was alone. His expression was the most human she had ever seen it. And then it wasn't. The walls came back up so fast she almost heard the sound of them. "How long," he said, very quietly, "were you standing there?" Charlotte did not step back. "Long enough. This corridor is not for your use." "I wasn't aware there were rules about standing in a hallway." "You are now." His voice was low and level, but she could hear the thing underneath it, the edge that came not from cruelty, but from something much more frightened than cruelty. "You will not come near this room again. You will not speak of what you heard tonight, not to the staff, not to your father, not in any letter you write." His eyes held hers. "Not ever." She looked at him steadily. "And if I do?" "Then I will send you back to your father with nothing." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "And your family will lose everything they have left." The threat settled between them like a stone dropped in still water. Charlotte let it sit. Then she said, "You would send a woman back to poverty for hearing you play the piano." His jaw tightened. "What I do in the privacy of my own home is clearly something you cannot let anyone see." She tilted her head slightly. "That tells me something about you, Mr. Blackwood." "Does it?" "It does." She kept his gaze. "Because what I heard tonight wasn't the music of a cold man." He went very still. It sounded like grief. Nothing moved in his face. Nothing moved in the whole corridor. Then Nathaniel Blackwood took one step back and said in a voice stripped of everything except its own exhaustion, "Go to your room, Mrs. Blackwood." Charlotte looked at him for one more moment, at the careful stillness of him, at the loosened cravat, at the man who had threatened her with poverty 30 seconds ago and now couldn't quite meet her eyes. Then she turned and walked back down the corridor. She did not look back. She didn't need to. She already understood something now that she hadn't understood this morning. Something no contract, no ceremony, no 14-minute wedding could have told her. The coldest man in Massachusetts was not cold at all. He was hiding. And whatever it was he was hiding from had been locked inside that room for 3 years, playing itself out in the dark, note by note, in the only language he had left. She had heard him. And no matter what he threatened, that much could not be taken back. She did not sleep well. Not because the bed was uncomfortable. It was the finest mattress she had ever laid on in her life. But because her mind kept circling back to the same thing. The way the music had sounded through the wall. The way his face had looked in that doorway. The way his voice had cracked open just slightly at the seam before he sealed it back shut. Charlotte had grown up around men who performed their authority loudly. Her father had stormed inside and delivered pronouncements from the head of the table like a man who needed witnesses to his own importance. The men in their social circle were much the same. Their power lived in volume. Nathaniel Blackwood's power lived somewhere else entirely, somewhere quieter, somewhere she hadn't found the edge of yet. That was the thing that kept her awake. She rose before 6, dressed without waking Margaret, went downstairs. The house was not yet moving. The staff didn't begin their rounds until 6:30, and the peculiar stillness of early morning had settled over everything like a held breath. Charlotte moved through it carefully, learning the layout. Which stairs creaked, which doors opened silently, which corridors caught the morning light first. She found the kitchen, and she found the cook, a wide, red-faced woman named Della, standing at the hearth with an expression of absolute shock. "Ma'am!" Della straightened immediately. "I didn't expect—" "Please don't change what you were doing," Charlotte said. "I only came for tea." Della stared at her. "The previous Mrs. Blackwood," she said carefully, "never came to the kitchen." Charlotte pulled out a stool and sat at the work table. "Then I imagine you spent a great deal of time guessing what she wanted." "Yes, ma'am, frequently. I find that guessing wastes everyone's time." She folded her hands on the table. "I take my tea plain. I don't eat before 8. I'm not particular about the menu, except that I cannot abide sage in anything. It tastes like regret." She paused. "What do you know about this household, Della, that nobody has thought to tell me?" Della's ladle hovered in the air. "Ma'am? You've worked here how long?" 9 years. "Then you know everything." Charlotte looked at her directly. "And nobody has asked you, I'd wager." Della set the ladle down slowly. Then she looked toward the door, a quick, reflexive check, and seemed to make a decision. "Mr. Blackwood takes his breakfast alone," she said. "Has for 3 years. He eats at exactly 7:30, same meal every morning. He doesn't vary. He doesn't ask for anything different." A pause. "In the beginning, the first years he was here, he used to come down on Sunday mornings and ask me to make whatever I felt like making. Said he liked surprises." Her voice went quieter. "He doesn't anymore." Charlotte absorbed that. "The locked rooms," she said. Della picked the ladle back up. "That's not something I'm able to speak on, ma'am. But you know. I know things that aren't mine to tell." She met Charlotte's eyes steadily. "Some doors in this house have been shut a long time. The people who tried to open them before you didn't fare well." Charlotte picked up her tea. "Is that a warning?" "It's an observation." Della turned back to the hearth. "There's a difference." She had been at Blackwood Estate for 4 days when the first social obligation arrived. A card, delivered by a boy on horseback, bearing an invitation to a garden supper at the Harrington Estate, 2 miles east. The card was addressed to Mr. and Mrs. Nathaniel Blackwood, which still landed strangely every single time Charlotte saw it written down. She found her husband in his study, a room he occupied with the concentrated silence of a man who had made it clear, without using a single word, that interruption was not welcome. She knocked anyway. "Come." She opened the door and held out the card. He took it, read it, set it on his desk. "We'll go," he said. "I thought you might want to discuss." "There is nothing to discuss. We'll go. You'll be introduced. People will ask you questions." He returned his eyes to the papers in front of him. "Answer them briefly and pleasantly. Don't volunteer information." Charlotte kept her hand on the doorframe. "What information specifically?" He looked up, that careful measuring look. "Anything personal." "Such as why we married?" "Such as anything personal," he said again. "Nathaniel." She used his name deliberately, the first time she'd used it directly in conversation, without prompting. His pen stopped moving. "People are going to ask, women especially. They always ask." She kept her voice level. "If we haven't decided what the answer is, we'll give them two different ones, and then it becomes a story." He sat back in his chair. The pen stayed still. "Tell them it was a mutual arrangement," he said at last. "Two practical people who saw the benefit of partnership." "That sounds like a business merger." "It is a business merger." Charlotte tilted her head. "Then we'll spend the first 3 months of our marriage defending it to every woman in Massachusetts." Something moved across his face, not quite amusement, close to it. "What would you suggest?" he said. "Tell them we met through friends, that it was brief but decisive." She held his gaze. "People accept certainty better than they accept honesty. If we say it like we mean it, they'll decide they believe it." He was quiet for a moment. "You have a very pragmatic view of social performance," he said. "I've been performing socially since I was 12 years old." She said it without bitterness, only fact. "I know what holds an audience." He looked at her, a long, considered look, the kind he gave her sometimes that felt less like assessment and more like he was trying to categorize something that hadn't fit any category he'd been given. Then he nodded once. "Friday evening," he said. "I'll have the carriage ready at 7. She turned to go. "Charlotte." She stopped. "Don't," he said carefully, "attempt to play the piano between now and then." The reminder of the corridor, the warning restated. Quieter this time, without the threat. Almost like a request. She looked at him over her shoulder. "I haven't," she said. "I won't." A beat. "As long as you're playing, it doesn't need a second voice." She left before he could answer. The Harrington supper was exactly what Charlotte had expected, and precisely as exhausting. 17 guests on a wide back lawn, the July heat barely moved by the shade of 3 old oaks. The women arranged themselves in a loose cluster near the refreshments, and the men migrated toward the far end of the lawn in the specific way men always did when they wanted to discuss money without being overheard. Charlotte stood among the women and felt them sizing her up with the polished subtlety of people who had been doing it their whole lives. "We were so surprised to hear about the marriage," said Eleanor Harrington, their hostess, in the tone of someone who had not been surprised at all, and have, in fact, been the first to spread the news. "Nathaniel gave no indication he was considering—" "Well," she smiled. "How did you two meet, precisely?" "Through mutual friends," Charlotte said. "It was brief but decisive." "How romantic," said Eleanor. "We found it practical," Charlotte said. "Then, precisely as planned. But I suppose some things are both." A ripple of soft laughter. A few approving looks. Eleanor seemed to file the answer away, but accept it. The women asked the expected questions. Charlotte answered them with the right amount of warmth and the right amount of vagueness, and she watched how the information traveled from woman to woman, passed in small glances and tiny lifted eyebrows and barely there nods. She watched Nathaniel across the lawn. He stood with 3 men she didn't know, holding a glass he wasn't drinking from, wearing the expression he always wore, that absolute, controlled stillness. One of the men said something. The others laughed. Nathaniel's mouth curved slightly in a way that didn't quite reach anything further north. He happened to glance toward her at that exact moment. Their eyes met across 20 feet of summer grass. She gave him a small, calm nod, the wordless signal they hadn't planned, but somehow both understood. I'm all right. You're all right. We're managing. He held her gaze for 2 full seconds, then looked away. It was the carriage ride home that cracked something open. They were 15 minutes from the estate when the carriage hit a rut hard enough to send Charlotte's shoulder into the side panel. She caught herself quickly, barely registered it, but apparently he did. Are you hurt? His voice came sharp and immediate, stripped of its usual careful management. I'm fine, she said, surprised by the quickness of it. He settled back. The mask came back. The South Road is poorly maintained after the rains. I noticed. Silence. Then, and she didn't plan it, it simply came out. Mrs. Wentworth told me your wife was the most beautiful woman in the county. The inside of the carriage went very still. He didn't look at her. Did she? He said. She said it like she expected it to wound me. Charlotte kept her voice neutral. I imagine she expected me to be jealous. And are you? Of a dead woman? Charlotte turned to look at him. No, but I am curious about her. That is not a conversation I intend to have. I'm not asking for details. She watched his profile. I'm only telling you that people will make comparisons. In public. They already are. A pause. I can manage it, but I need to know whether it bothers you when they do. He was quiet for a long time. It does not bother me, he said at last. She heard the lie in it, clean and practiced. The way a man tells a lie he has repeated so many times, he almost believes it. All right, she said simply, and let it go. He turned to look at her then, just briefly, just a flash, with something behind his eyes that looked almost like relief, as though he had expected to be pushed, as though not being pushed was a thing he had forgotten was possible. He didn't say anything. Neither did she. But something in the carriage shifted between them. Not warmth exactly. Something earlier than warmth. The preliminary thing. The moment just before 2 people stop being strangers and haven't yet decided what to be instead. The letter arrived on a Monday, 11 days after the wedding. Charlotte was in the East Wing sitting room when Margaret brought it. A cream envelope with no return address. The handwriting inside slanted and somehow aggressive in a way Charlotte couldn't quite name. She read it twice. Then she sat very still. The letter was addressed to Nathaniel, delivered to the house, and somehow, through some error of the household staff, or perhaps no error at all, it had ended up in her sitting room. She should not have read it. She had read it anyway, and now she sat with the knowledge inside her like something swallowed wrong, trying to decide what to do with it. The letter was from a woman named Suzanne Alcott, who wrote with the particular confidence of a person who believed herself indispensable. The tone was intimate. The references were oblique. But the final paragraph was not oblique at all. He will tire of this arrangement. He always does. Come back to Boston when you remember what you actually want. Charlotte folded the letter. She sat with it for 37 minutes. She counted. She always counted. Before she made a decision. She went to his study, knocked, entered. He looked up. She placed the letter on his desk. "It was delivered to my sitting room," she said. "I don't know whether that was intentional or an error. Either way, I read it. I'm telling you that directly rather than pretending I didn't." His eyes went to the letter. Something moved through his face that she couldn't fully track. Too fast, too controlled, compressed down before it could show itself fully. "Suzanne Alcott," he said. "Yes." "Old acquaintance." "I gathered." He looked at her steadily. "And what conclusions did you draw?" "None," Charlotte said. "I didn't ask questions about your life before Friday, and I'm not starting now. But I thought you should know it arrived, and I thought you should know. I'm not a woman who reads private correspondence and keeps it to herself." She kept his gaze. "If letters come to this house addressed to you, they should be given to you. If they continue to find their way to my sitting room, I'd like us to agree that I'll continue to bring them to you directly." He looked at her for a long moment, the kind of look that made her feel like he was searching for the angle, the ulterior motive, the calculation underneath the plainness. He didn't find one, because there wasn't one. "All right," he said quietly. "All right," she echoed. She turned to leave. "Charlotte." She stopped. "The letter says nothing that requires your concern." His voice was careful, not cold, careful, which was not the same thing. "Whatever she imagines she knows about this house, she's wrong." Charlotte turned back and looked at him. "I know," she said. "I could tell from the tone of it." He frowned slightly. "How?" She wrote like a woman who has been kept at a distance for so long, she started to confuse distance with mystery. Charlotte said it without cruelty, only observation. "If she truly knew you, she wouldn't have written that letter. She would have known it wouldn't work." A beat. Then something crossed his face that she had never seen there before. Not quite vulnerability, but the shadow of it, the outline where vulnerability would live if he ever let it. "You have read a great deal," he said, "into a very short acquaintance." "I read people," Charlotte said, "same as I read contracts." She let a moment pass. "It reduces unpleasant surprises." She left, and behind her, she heard it. Not music this time. A sound so slight, she almost missed it entirely. Nathaniel Blackwood, exhaling, like a man who had been holding his breath for 3 years, and had only just, for the first time, let the smallest part of it go. She found Mrs. Hargrove in the laundry corridor 2 hours later, and she asked her directly. "The music room. Was it locked before Mrs. Blackwood died, or after?" Mrs. Hargrove stopped walking. "After," she said. "The night of the funeral." "He locked it himself?" "Yes, ma'am." Charlotte absorbed that. "What happened to her?" she asked. "The first Mrs. Blackwood. What actually happened?" Mrs. Hargrove turned to face her fully. Her sharp eyes were unreadable, but not unkind. "She died in childbirth," she said. "The baby, too." Charlotte felt the information settle into her. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "Yes." Mrs. Hargrove's voice softened for just a fraction. "He hasn't played since the night before the funeral. 3 years of silence from that room." She paused. "Until last week." Charlotte looked up. "He played last week," Mrs. Hargrove said, and her eyes held something deliberate in them, something pointed, something that wanted to make sure Charlotte understood exactly what she was being told. "The first time since she died." A long pause. "Whatever you said to him in that corridor, Mrs. Blackwood, whatever it was, something moved." Charlotte stood very still. "I didn't say anything particularly important," she said. No. Mrs. Hargrove looked at her steadily. Sometimes that's exactly what a person needs to hear. She walked away, and Charlotte stood alone in the empty corridor, with the weight of what she'd just learned pressing quiet and heavy into her chest. Not grief exactly, not yet, but something close to it. The understanding that the locked room and the locked man were the same wound. That every deliberate silence, every controlled stillness, every careful barrier Nathaniel Blackwood had built was the architecture of a man who had lost something irreplaceable and had decided, in the aftermath, that the safest response to love was the complete removal of it. And somehow, without intending to, she had walked into this house and heard the music that proved it wasn't gone, only buried. She pressed her hand briefly to the wall. Then she walked back to her sitting room, sat down at the writing desk, and began a letter to her father that said, "I am well. The house is large. The man is complicated. But I am not unhappy, and I think that matters." She signed it, sealed it, and set it aside. Then she sat quietly for a long time, thinking about a man who had locked a room the night before his wife's funeral, and every single night for 3 years after that, and had only started to open the door again the week she arrived. She didn't know what to do with that yet, but she held it carefully, the way she held everything that mattered. 3 weeks into the marriage, Charlotte learned that Nathaniel Blackwood kept to his routines the way some men kept to religion, not out of joy, but out of the need to believe that structure could hold a life together when everything else had come loose. 7:30 breakfast. Alone. His study from 8 until noon. A silent walk across the property. She could hear his boots on the gravel from her window. From noon until 1. Lunch. Alone again. The study until 6. Dinner at 7, which she had gradually made less silent simply by refusing to match his quiet with her own. She had learned that he could endure her questions better than he could endure the sound of nothing. And she had learned, without him ever saying so directly, that she was the only person in the house who did not flinch when he walked into a room. That mattered to him, she could tell. Not because he said it, because of the small, involuntary exhale he made sometimes when he sat across from her at dinner. The exhale of a man who had spent the whole day bracing and had finally arrived somewhere he didn't have to. She didn't tell him she'd noticed. She held it carefully, the way she held everything she wasn't sure what to do with yet. The morning of the 22nd day, Charlotte came downstairs at her usual early hour and found a book on the kitchen work table. No note, no explanation. Just a slim volume of American poetry, placed precisely where she always set her tea. She looked at Della. Della stared very hard at the porridge. "When did this get here?" Charlotte asked. "Couldn't say, ma'am." "Della?" "Before 6, Della said, carefully, still not looking up. Charlotte picked up the book, opened it. No inscription, no marking of any kind. Just the book itself, placed where she would find it, by a man who would apparently rather die than be caught doing something kind. She pressed her lips together against a smile. "Tell him thank you," she said. "Tell who, ma'am?" "Della." "Yes, ma'am." The woman's mouth twitched. "I'll pass that along." She was reading that same book in the East Wing sitting room that afternoon when she heard the voices. 2 of them, male, coming from the entrance hall below, loud enough to carry through the floor in the way that only voices raised in genuine anger ever carried. She didn't move at first. Then one of the voices said her father's name. She was on her feet and at the top of the stairs in seconds. Below her, in the entrance hall, Nathaniel stood facing a man she had never seen before. Broad-shouldered, florid-faced, the particular kind of red that came not from sun, but from temper. 50 years old, at least. Well-dressed in the way of a man who had earned money recently and not yet learned to wear it naturally. "The Whitmore estate was surveyed 3 years ago," the man said, and his voice had the grinding quality of someone who had rehearsed this. "The northern boundary puts half of that timberland on Blackwood property. You know that. Whitmore knew that. And yet—" "You'll lower your voice in my house," Nathaniel said. He said it exactly the same way he said everything. Steady, measured, quiet. And it had the immediate effect that tone always had on men who mistook volume for power. The visitor stopped, recalibrated, lowered his voice, but not his chin. "I have papers, Blackwood. Legal survey papers. The Whitmore family owes me—" "The Whitmore family," Nathaniel said, "is my family now." Charlotte gripped the banister. She had not expected that. The visitor turned his head slightly, saw her on the stairs. His eyes moved over her with an assessment she had felt before from men like this. The particular look that calculated worth and found it negotiable. This must be the new wife. He smiled the wrong kind of smile. "You married quickly after the funeral, didn't you, Thomas? Cleared the debt and cleaned the hands all in one—" "You are speaking," Nathaniel said, stepping forward one pace, "about my wife." Everything in the entrance hall went very still. The visitor's smile flickered. Charlotte descended the rest of the stairs slowly. She reached the bottom, stood beside Nathaniel, and turned to look at the visitor the way her mother had once taught her to look at men who needed to be reminded of the size of the room. "I don't believe we've been introduced," she said. The visitor cleared his throat. "Gerald Marsh. I have a land claim against the Whitmore property that predates—" "That predates the marriage," Charlotte said, "which means it predates my involvement. And any legal remedy you believe you have would need to be pursued through the appropriate channels." She kept her voice pleasant, light almost. "I'm happy to connect you with my husband's lawyer, Mr. Prescott. He handles all matters relating to the estate." Marsh stared at her. "The survey papers can be submitted to Mr. Prescott," Charlotte said, "who will review them. If the claim has merit, it will be addressed accordingly. If it doesn't," she smiled, "you'll have wasted a trip." A long, cold silence. Then Marsh looked at Nathaniel. "You've married a lawyer." "I've married a woman with better sense than most lawyers I've met," Nathaniel said. "I'd suggest you take the advice she's offered." Marsh left. Charlotte waited until the door closed. Then she exhaled. "He'll come back," she said. "I know." "The survey papers, are they legitimate?" Nathaniel was quiet for a beat. "Partially. The northern boundary is disputed. It has been for years." He turned toward the study. "I'll contact Prescott today." "My father knew about this?" He stopped. "Your father," he said carefully, "knew about a great many things he did not tell you." He kept walking. Charlotte stood in the entrance hall by herself, with the cold, particular weight of that sentence settling through her. Not quite a revelation, not quite a surprise, but the confirmation of a fear she'd carried since the day she burned her mother's letters, the quiet dread that her father's debts went deeper than money. She thought of Marsh's face, the prepared speech, the survey papers held in ready. She thought of her father saying, "He is a good man," in the voice of a man who needed badly for that to be true. And then she went to find a piece of paper and wrote her father a letter that said, in the plainest terms she knew, "Tell me everything, all of it, before someone else does." The reply came 4 days later. She read it alone, twice, then a third time, slower. Her father had borrowed money from Gerald Marsh 2 years before the bankruptcy. Not a small amount, a significant one, backed by a verbal agreement regarding the northern timberland, an agreement he had made without consulting a lawyer, without documentation, without telling a single soul. When the investment failed and the debts mounted, he had let Marsh believe the land would be surrendered. Then, when Nathaniel's offer came through, he had used the settlement to clear the documented debts and said nothing about Marsh, nothing about the timber, nothing about any of it. He had handed his daughter to a man as part of a transaction that wasn't fully disclosed. Charlotte set the letter down on the desk. She sat with her hands flat on the table. She was not a woman who raged. She had never been. Her anger lived deep and cold and still, like water under ice. You could stand on it, and it would hold you, and you would not see it moving until the spring came and it began to break. She felt it moving now. She went to Nathaniel's study, knocked, entered without waiting. He looked up, registered her face, and set his pen down immediately. "Sit down," he said. "I'm fine standing." "Charlotte." His voice was low. "Sit down." She sat. She put the letter on his desk. He read it without expression. Then he looked up. "You didn't know," he said. "No," she said. "I did not know." She kept her hands still. "Did you?" The pause was a fraction too long. "Nathaniel." "I knew there was a secondary claim," he said. "I didn't know the terms of it." "But you knew something." "I knew your father had been less than fully transparent. Yes." Charlotte looked at him. She looked at him the way she had looked at the contract in Prescott's office, reading every line, every pause, every word placed and every word withheld. "And you married me anyway," she said. "The core transaction was sound." "That is not what I asked." He held her gaze. "Yes, I married you anyway." "Why?" He said nothing. "Nathaniel, why?" "Because if my father deceived both of us, we ought to at least be honest with each other about what we know." She leaned forward slightly. "Why did you go through with it when you knew he wasn't telling you everything?" He looked at her for a long, measured moment. "Because I'd met you," he said quietly, "in Prescott's office. And I decided that whatever your father had omitted, you were not your father." The room went very quiet. Charlotte absorbed that. "That was either very wise," she said at last, "or very reckless." "I'm aware of both possibilities." She exhaled, stood, walked to the window and stood with her back to him. "I want to be involved in the Marsh situation," she said. "I won't be managed around it. It concerns my family's name, and, by extension, my name now, and I have the right to understand it fully." "Agreed." She turned around. "That was fast." "I'm not in the habit of arguing with reasonable positions." His voice was dry. "It wastes time." She looked at him, at the controlled stillness of him, at the man who had known her father was hiding something, and had looked across Prescott's desk and decided she was worth the risk anyway. And she felt something shift in her chest. Something small, but significant. The way a key turns in a lock that hasn't been opened in a long time. She didn't say anything about it. "I'll need to see all the survey documents," she said. "I'll have Prescott send them by Thursday." "Thank you." She was at the door when he said, "Charlotte." She looked back. "Your father made poor choices," he said carefully. "That has no bearing on what I think of you." She held his gaze for a moment. "I know," she said, "but it was kind of you to say it out loud." Thursday came. Friday. The survey documents arrived. Charlotte spread them across the dining table and spent the better part of 2 days learning how to read them, asking questions of Prescott when he visited, asking questions of Nathaniel in the evenings, refusing to pretend she understood things she didn't. Nathaniel watched her work. She caught him watching sometimes, from the doorway of the dining room, with that look she was learning to recognize. The one that wasn't assessment anymore. The one that was something else. Something without a clean name. Something that arrived in his face before he could arrange it into the controlled stillness he kept as his default. "You could sit down," she said one evening, without looking up from the maps, instead of standing in the door. He came in, sat at the opposite end of the table, pulled one of the documents toward him. They worked in silence for an hour. Not the heavy, managed silence of their first dinners. Something different. The comfortable kind. The kind that only existed between two people who had stopped needing to fill the space with proof that they were at ease. At some point, his hand moved across the table to tap a specific section of the survey map. "Here," he said. "The disputed line runs here. Marsh's claim depends on an 1806 survey that was conducted by his own family's surveyor, which makes it self-serving, which makes it contestable." Their heads were close together over the map. She could smell wood smoke and cedar, the specific smell of his jacket, which she had catalogued without intending to. She was aware of the proximity in the way she was always aware of it when it happened, clearly, involuntarily, and with a slight irritation at herself for noticing. "If we get an independent survey," she started. "Already arranged," he said. She looked at him. "Prescott filed for it Monday," he said. "We should have results within 3 weeks." She studied him for a moment. "You move fast. Marsh will move faster if we give him time." A pause. "I don't intend to let a man with a manufactured claim threaten this family." This family. The words landed differently than she expected. She looked back at the map. "Thank you," she said quietly. "You don't need to thank me for protecting what's mine." He said it the same way he said most things. Measured, undecorated. But something in it ran beneath the practical surface. Something that hadn't been there 3 weeks ago. Charlotte kept her eyes on the survey lines. "Is that what I am?" He went very still. "Yes," he said. Without the hedge. Without the qualification. Just the one word, landing clean and certain in the space between them. She did not look up, but her hand, resting on the edge of the table, stopped moving, and she stayed exactly where she was, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him beside her. And she let the word sit between them without trying to examine it or file it away. For a little while, she simply let it be. It was Margaret who told her. The girl came to Charlotte's sitting room on a Wednesday evening with the look of someone carrying a thing that had been pressing on her for days and had finally grown too heavy. "Ma'am," she said, "I need to tell you something." Charlotte set down her book. "Come in." Margaret came in, stood twisting her apron. "Gerald Marsh," she said. "He spoke to one of the stable boys last week. Paid him, I think. Asked him questions about the house." She swallowed. "About you, your habits, when you walk in the garden, whether Mr. Blackwood is away on any regular days." Charlotte went still. "Thomas," she said, the stable boy's name. "How old is he?" 16, ma'am. Did he tell Marsh anything useful?" "I don't know. I think he told him your morning schedule." Charlotte looked at her. "How do you know this?" "Thomas told me." Margaret's chin came up slightly. "He felt bad about it. He didn't know what Marsh wanted the information for. He thought it was just neighborly curiosity." "It isn't." Charlotte stood. "Margaret, I want you to go tell Mrs. Hargrove what you just told me. Exactly as you told me. And I want Mrs. Hargrove to come to me immediately." "Yes, ma'am." The girl didn't move. "Is Marsh going to cause trouble?" Charlotte looked at her, at the 16-year-old girl's face, plainly frightened, plainly wanting to be told everything was going to be fine. "Yes," Charlotte said. Probably. But trouble that's expected is trouble that can be managed. She looked at the girl steadily. You did right in telling me. Remember that. Margaret left. Charlotte stood alone in her sitting room for 30 seconds, and then she walked directly to Nathaniel's study, knocked once, and opened the door. He looked up. Marsh has been asking about my schedule, she said. He paid Thomas to watch the house. Nathaniel set down his pen. The movement was completely controlled, precise. But his eyes changed. Something cold moved through them. The kind of cold that had nothing to do with distance and everything to do with a man calculating exactly how far he was willing to go. Since when? He said. Last week, at least. He stood. I'll deal with it. I want to know what dealing with it means, she said. It means Marsh will understand that this household is not accessible to his surveillance, and that any further intimidation attempts will be met with immediate legal response. He came around the desk. It also means I'll be speaking with Prescott about accelerating the survey. He was already moving toward the door. Nathaniel, she caught his arm. He stopped, looked down at her hand on his sleeve. She almost released it, almost stepped back into the careful distance they had maintained since the beginning. But she held on. Don't go to Marsh tonight, she said. Whatever you're thinking, wait until morning, until you've spoken to Prescott. Something in his face moved. You think I'll do something rash? I think you'll do something effective, she said. And I think there's a version of effective that solves the immediate problem and creates a larger one. She kept her eyes on his. Wait, please. He looked at her hand on his arm. Then he looked at her face. And something happened in his expression that she had never seen there before. Not the careful mask, not the controlled assessment, but something unguarded, something that came from a place that hadn't been opened in a very long time. He covered her hand with his. One brief, careful press of his palm over her fingers. Then he stepped back, cleared his throat. In the morning, he said, in the voice of a man returning to himself from somewhere else entirely. I'll contact Prescott. Thank you, she said. He nodded once, went back to his desk, sat down. Charlotte stood in the doorway a moment longer, her hand still warm from where his had rested on it. Then she walked back to her sitting room and sat in her chair and stared at nothing for a long time. Because she understood now, clearly, finally, without any more room for argument, that this was no longer simply a transaction. Maybe it hadn't been for some time, and somewhere in this house, behind a locked door on the second floor of the east corridor, a piano sat waiting. Patient as grief, patient as the particular kind of longing that doesn't announce itself, that only makes itself known in the small, unguarded moments when a man's hand covers a woman's and holds it just long enough to mean something. She pressed her fingers together in her lap, and she held it carefully, the way she held everything that mattered most. Prescott arrived the following morning before breakfast. Charlotte heard his voice in the entrance hall and came downstairs still pinning her hair, because whatever conversation was about to happen in that study, she had made clear she intended to be part of it. She pushed the door open without knocking. Both men looked at her. Nathaniel said nothing. He pulled out the third chair at the side table. She sat. Prescott cleared his throat and began. The news was not good. Marsh had filed a formal legal claim with the county court 2 days prior. Not just the timberland now, but a secondary claim against the eastern boundary of the Whitmore property, citing the same 1806 survey. 2 claims, filed simultaneously. The kind of move a man made when he wanted to overwhelm rather than persuade. He's not trying to win both, Charlotte said. He's trying to make us spend money and time defending against both so we'll settle one." Prescott looked at her with the particular expression of a lawyer who had just heard his own conclusions stated by someone who wasn't supposed to understand it yet. "Yes," he said. "That is likely the strategy." "Then we don't defend both," she turned to Nathaniel. "We hit the primary claim hard and fast before the secondary one gains any traction. If we destroy his evidentiary basis for the timber claim, the eastern boundary claim loses its scaffolding." Nathaniel was watching her. "The independent survey," he said. "How fast can it be done?" she asked Prescott. 2 weeks, perhaps 10 days if I push the surveyor." "Push the surveyor," she said. Prescott looked at Nathaniel, who gave a single nod. "There's something else," Prescott said, and his voice shifted into the register of a man delivering the part he'd been putting off. "Marsh has retained counsel. The lawyer he's hired is Edmund Graves." The name meant nothing to Charlotte, but it meant something to Nathaniel. His expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes went very still. The particular stillness of recognition, and not the comfortable kind. "Who is Edmund Graves?" Charlotte asked. Prescott and Nathaniel exchanged a look. "He's the lawyer who handled my first wife's estate," Nathaniel said. The room went quiet. Charlotte kept her voice level. "And that means what, exactly?" "It means," Nathaniel said, in the careful tone of a man choosing each word with deliberate precision, "that Graves has access to information about this family's financial history that a stranger should not have." "What kind of information?" "The kind that Marsh could use to complicate the land dispute into something more personal." He stood, walked to the window, stood with his back to them both. "Eliza's estate was larger than I've discussed publicly. There were debts of her own, separate from mine, that were settled privately after her death. Graves managed the settlement." Charlotte looked at the back of his shoulders. "And if Marsh gets access to those records?" "He'll use them to argue that this family has a pattern of concealed financial obligations." He turned around. "He'll use it to make a land dispute look like a character indictment." Charlotte stood. "Then we need to see those records before he does." "I have copies," Prescott said quickly. "I can have them to you by tomorrow." "Today," Charlotte said. Prescott blinked. "Today," Nathaniel echoed. "Thank you, Prescott." The lawyer gathered his papers and left. Charlotte and Nathaniel stood on opposite sides of the room and looked at each other in the particular way of two people who had just realized the ground beneath them was less solid than they'd been standing on. "How bad is it?" she asked. "The estate records. How bad?" He was quiet for a long moment. "Eliza had debts I didn't know about when we married," he said. "I found out after her death. The settlement was handled privately because—" He stopped. "Because there were aspects of how those debts were incurred that I didn't want made public." Charlotte held very still. "Was she—" She chose the word carefully. "Was she dishonest with you?" He looked at her directly. "In more ways than one, yes." She absorbed that. All the things she hadn't asked. All the things Mrs. Hargrove had carefully not said. The locked music room. The 3 years of silence. The piano played only in the dark. "The child," she said quietly. "Mrs. Hargrove told me she died in childbirth." "Yes." "Was the child—" "I don't know." His voice was steady, terribly steady. The steadiness of a man who had asked himself the same question every day for 3 years and had learned to carry it without buckling. "I never knew, and I made the decision after her death that I would not pursue the answer, because the answer couldn't change what had already happened, and it would only—" He stopped again. "Only make it worse," Charlotte finished. "Yes." She looked at him, at the man standing in front of her, who had been carrying that particular weight in total silence, alone, in a house full of people who either didn't know or were too afraid of him to ask. And she felt something move through her chest that was neither pity nor sympathy, but something deeper and less comfortable than either. "Nathaniel," she said. He looked at her. "Whatever is in those records, whatever Marsh tries to use, we face it together." She kept her eyes on his. "This is my name now, too. I'm not standing to one side while someone uses your past to dismantle your present." He didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was lower than usual, stripped of something. "You didn't sign on for this," he said. "I signed on for your debts and your household," she said. "This comes with both." She held his gaze. "I'm not complaining. I'm telling you, I'm here." He looked at her for a long time. Then he said, very quietly, "I know." The documents arrived that afternoon. Charlotte and Nathaniel spent 4 hours at the dining table, reading through them together. The records of Eliza Blackwood's estate, her private debts, the names of the creditors, the amounts settled. Charlotte read in silence and did not react. She had taught herself, young, to read difficult things without showing the difficulty on her face. But there was one document, near the bottom of the pile, that made her set everything else down. A letter, written by Eliza, dated 6 weeks before her death, addressed to a man named Robert Alcott. Charlotte looked at the name, looked again. Alcott. The same name as the woman who had written to Nathaniel 3 weeks ago. Suzanne Alcott, who had written with the confidence of someone who believed herself indispensable. "He will tire of this arrangement. Come back to Boston when you remember what you actually want." Charlotte set the letter down very carefully. "Nathaniel." He looked up from his own documents. She pushed the letter across the table without a word. He read it. She watched his face. He read it once, then again. And the thing that crossed his expression was not surprise. It was the specific, complicated grief of a confirmation. The thing you already suspected, arriving in writing, proving itself true in ink. Robert Alcott. Eliza's creditor. Eliza's correspondent. Almost certainly Eliza's reason. And Suzanne Alcott. His sister, perhaps, or his wife. Writing now to Nathaniel with the comfortable familiarity of someone who had been close to this story for years. "She knew you'd find it eventually," Charlotte said. Yes. His voice was entirely even. She counted on the fact that by then it wouldn't matter. "She was wrong about that." Yes. He set the letter down. She frequently was. Charlotte looked at him. "Is this what Marsh has? This connection?" "Graves will have access to the correspondence. The Alcott name." He leaned back in his chair. "Yes, this is almost certainly the angle." Charlotte thought for a moment. "Then we take the angle away from him." "How?" "We don't hide it." She looked at Nathaniel steadily. "Whatever Marsh plans to do with this, expose it publicly to undermine your character. Use it to suggest the land dispute is part of a longer pattern of concealment. We get ahead of it. We disclose what we choose to disclose in the way we choose to frame it, before he can." He stared at her. "You're suggesting we tell people about Eliza." "I'm suggesting we tell the right people the right amount before Marsh tells everyone everything." She kept her voice calm. "You control the story, or the story controls you. Those are the only 2 options." He was quiet. "Who would you tell?" he asked. "Prescott. The Harringtons. Eleanor Harrington is the information center of this county. And if she hears it from us first, she'll protect it. A few others, she thought quickly. Not the details, just the shape of it. That Eliza had private debts, that they were settled, that someone is now attempting to use that history to manufacture leverage in a land dispute. She held his gaze. People will believe a man who tells his own story before they believe a man who profits from someone else's. He looked at the letter on the table. Then he looked at her. "You are remarkably good at this," he said. And it wasn't a compliment exactly. It was more like a man identifying a quality he hadn't anticipated and didn't entirely know what to do with. "I grew up in a house where the truth was always slightly worse than advertised," she said. "I learned early that managing information was a survival skill." He was quiet for a long time. "All right," he said. "We do it your way." They went to the Harringtons on Saturday. Not for a supper this time. A private call. Charlotte and Nathaniel seated in Eleanor Harrington's front parlor. Charlotte managing the conversation with the precision of a woman who knew exactly what she was doing, and had decided to do it with grace. She told Eleanor just enough. The shape of the situation, the Alcott connection, the pending land dispute, the fact that a lawyer with access to old estate records was now in the employ of a man trying to manufacture a claim against the Blackwood property. Eleanor listened with the focused attention of a woman who understood immediately that she was being trusted with something valuable. "Gerald Marsh," Eleanor said when Charlotte finished. "I've never liked that man. He bought the Kendall property last year by pressuring the widow." Her voice was precise, sharp as a blade. "What do you need from me?" "Nothing specific," Charlotte said. "Only that if his name comes up in conversation, you have the context to understand the motive." Eleanor looked at Nathaniel. "She's protecting you." "She's protecting us both," Nathaniel said. Eleanor studied Charlotte for a moment. Something shifted in her expression. The specific recalibration of a woman who had come into this acquaintance expecting very little and had been repeatedly wrong about it. "You chose well," Eleanor said to Nathaniel. Nathaniel didn't look at Charlotte, but something in his posture changed, something settled. "Yes," he said. "I did." The independent survey results arrived on a Tuesday, 9 days later. Charlotte was in the kitchen with Della when she heard Nathaniel's voice in the hallway. Heard the particular quality of it that she had learned to distinguish from his ordinary tone. Not anger. Something more contained than anger. Something that preceded it. She came out. He was standing with a survey report in his hand. Prescott stood beside him. "The boundary is clear," Prescott said when he saw Charlotte. "The 1806 survey used by Marsh has a documented error in the eastern measurement. Our surveyor found the original survey markers. The timberland falls entirely within the Blackwood property." Charlotte breathed in slowly. "And the secondary claim?" "Without the primary, it has no foundation. Graves already knows it." Prescott actually smiled. A rare, careful smile. "He filed for a withdrawal this morning." Charlotte looked at Nathaniel. He looked at her, and for a moment, just a moment, the careful control he kept around himself at all times slipped sideways, and she saw something underneath it that she had only glimpsed before. Something warm. Something that had been waiting behind 3 years of locked rooms and deliberate silence. Patient as the music he played in the dark. He crossed the hallway in 3 steps and took her hands. Not the brief, careful press from before. Both hands, held in both of his, with a firmness that said something his voice hadn't been able to say yet. "Thank you," he said, low and direct and entirely unmanaged. Charlotte looked at their hands, then at his face. "You would have gotten there without me," she said. Not as fast. His hands tightened slightly. And not the same way. Prescott became very interested in his documents. Charlotte let herself stay there, hands held, no distance between them, the entrance hall of a house that was beginning, slowly, to feel less like a place she was enduring and more like a place she was building. And she let herself feel the things she had been carefully not naming for weeks. Not named, but not unfamiliar. Not unfamiliar at all. That evening, Nathaniel did not go to his study after dinner. He stayed at the table. Charlotte noticed immediately the deviation from routine, the deliberate choice to remain, and she kept her expression neutral and continued her tea and did not make it into a ceremony, because she understood by now that the surest way to make him retreat was to mark his advances as significant. So she said, as easily as she could, "Do you want more tea?" "No." A pause. "Charlotte." "Yes." "The music room." He said it, looking at the table. "I intend to open it." She set down her cup, very carefully. "When?" she asked. "Tomorrow." He looked up. His eyes were steady and direct and carrying something enormous in them, that he was holding with the particular discipline of a man who had been holding enormous things alone for a very long time. "I want you there." The words landed in her chest like something physical. She looked at him. "I'll be there," she said. He nodded, looked away, then back, briefly, with the expression she had privately come to think of as his truest face, the one that existed in the space between the mask and whatever lived beneath it, the one that arrived without warning in the unguarded seconds and disappeared just as quickly. "Nathaniel," she said. He looked at her. "Whatever is in that room," she said quietly, "whatever it holds for you, you don't have to explain it. You don't have to make it make sense." She held his gaze. "I'll just be there." He was quiet for a long moment. "You do that," he said finally, low and careful. "You show up, and you don't ask for more than what a person is ready to give." He seemed to be working through it as he spoke, not a rehearsed thing, but a real-time accounting. "I've spent 3 years in this house, surrounded by people who either wanted something from me or were afraid of me. And you are—" He stopped. "I am," Charlotte said gently, when the silence stretched. A sound came out of him that was almost a laugh. Almost. The first time she had ever heard anything close to it from him. "You are entirely inconvenient," he said, "in the best possible way." Charlotte looked at him, at the hard, careful face of a man who was learning, slowly and with considerable effort, that being seen did not necessarily mean being destroyed. And she felt the thing she hadn't named take up more space in her chest than it had before. She didn't name it now, either, but she stopped trying to make it smaller. "Good night, Nathaniel," she said. "Good night, Charlotte." She walked upstairs, and behind her, she heard something she had not heard before in the daylight hours of this house. Not piano, not papers, not the measured footsteps of a man keeping to his schedule. Silence. But a different kind of silence than she'd walked into on the first night. Not the silence of a house holding its breath. Not the silence of a man managing his own emptiness. The silence of something that had just been decided. The silence of a door, somewhere inside a person, moving on its hinge for the first time in years. Not all the way, not yet, but enough. Enough to let the light in. She pressed her hand to the wall of the staircase the same way she had that day in the laundry corridor, when Mrs. Hargrove had told her the music had started again. "Tomorrow," he had said. "I want you there," he had said. Charlotte Whitmore, who had burned her mother's letters, who had signed her name to a contract, who had counted 14 minutes and 11 words and held everything that mattered carefully in both hands, walked the rest of the way to her room and sat at her writing desk and did not write anything. She simply sat and let the quiet settle around her like the first evening of something entirely new. She was awake before the sun, not because she hadn't slept. She had, finally, deeply, the way a person sleeps when something that has been pulling at them has finally been set down. She was awake because the morning felt different. The whole house felt different, like a held note in a piece of music right before the resolution. Tomorrow, he had said. Today was tomorrow. Charlotte dressed without rushing, pinned her hair the way she always did, practical, no ceremony. She went downstairs and found the kitchen already warm and Della at the hearth with her back conspicuously turned, giving Charlotte the privacy of her own thoughts in the only way she knew how. Charlotte sat, wrapped her hands around her tea. "Della," she said. "Ma'am? Has he come down yet?" A pause. "Passed through an hour ago, ma'am. Didn't eat." Charlotte absorbed that. A man who hadn't eaten at 7:30 for the first time in 3 years. She set down her cup and went upstairs. She found him in the east corridor, standing in front of the music room door with a key in his hand and his back to her, and the straightness of his spine told her everything she needed to know about how much this was costing him. She didn't say anything. She walked to him and stood beside him, not touching, just there. He didn't look at her. "I haven't been inside since the night before her funeral," he said. His voice was low and entirely steady and completely hollow. "I sat in there that night and played for 2 hours, and then I locked the door and told myself I'd open it when I was ready." "Were you ready?" "No. A beat. I'm still not." He looked at the key in his hand. "But I think I've been waiting for something that was never going to arrive on its own." Charlotte looked at the door. "Then we open it anyway," she said. He put the key in the lock. The sound it made, the click of the mechanism giving way, was the quietest, most significant sound she had heard since the first night she'd stood in this corridor and listened to him play through the wall. He pushed the door open, and he walked in. She followed him. The room was cool and still, the particular stillness of a closed space that has been holding the same air for years, the same temperature, the same silence layered over and over until it had a weight of its own. The piano sat at the far end. Nathaniel crossed to it the way a person approaches something they have been dreading, directly, without slowing, because slowing only gives fear time to grow. He sat on the bench, placed both hands flat on the closed lid, did not open it yet. Charlotte sat on the small chair by the window. She folded her hands in her lap and said nothing. "My mother taught me," he said. "This was her instrument. I had it brought here when she passed." Charlotte's chest tightened. "That's what I heard in the music." He looked at her. "The night in the corridor," she said quietly. "I told you it sounded like grief, but it was more specific than that. It sounded like someone playing music that belonged to another person, like you were keeping something alive." He looked at her for a long moment. "Yes," he said, the word barely audible. He opened the lid, looked at the keys. Then he played. Not the searching, careful piece she'd heard through the wall. Something simpler. A melody she didn't recognize. Small and unhurried. The kind of thing a parent plays to a child. The kind of thing that lives in the muscle memory of the hands and doesn't require thought. His hands moved over the keys, and his shoulders changed, and his face changed. And Charlotte sat in her chair and watched Nathaniel Blackwood come back to himself from wherever he had been for 3 years. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. She just stayed. He played for 20 minutes. When he stopped, the silence that followed was clean. Not the heavy, managed silence she had walked into on her first day. Something lighter. Something that had been relieved of a burden. He sat with his hands in his lap. "Eliza hated this room," he said. Charlotte waited. She said it made the house feel like a museum. He looked at the keys. She wanted it converted. A sitting room. Something useful. He paused. "We argued about it. One of the few things we argued about openly." A pause. "After she died, I understood that the argument hadn't been about the room." What had it been about? About the fact that I brought things into this marriage that were mine alone. He turned to look at Charlotte directly. My mother's instrument. My mother's music. Things she couldn't be part of and didn't want to learn. He held Charlotte's gaze. She wasn't a bad person. I want to be clear about that. She was unhappy. She had married me for reasons that made sense to her at the time, and stopped making sense later. And instead of telling me, He stopped. "Found another reason," Charlotte said gently. "Yes." He turned back to the piano. "I blamed myself for a long time," he said, "for not seeing it, for not being more, different, the kind of man she could have stayed for." He pressed one key, a single low note. "And then somewhere in the second year I stopped blaming myself and started just being empty, which was worse, I think." Charlotte looked at him, at the line of his shoulders, at the man who had married her for practical reasons and threatened her in a corridor, and covered her hand with his and said, "You're mine," and meant it in a way that had nothing to do with property. "Nathaniel," she said. He looked up. "You were not the reason she left." "Charlotte." "You were not the reason," she said again, steady and clear. "A person who loved you would have stayed in the argument, would have pushed back, would have played the piano badly and laughed about it, and tried." She held his gaze. "The fact that she didn't was not a measure of your worth. It was a measure of her fear." He looked at her for a long time. Then something in his face shifted. Not broke exactly. Something more deliberate than breaking. Like a man choosing to set something down that he had been carrying without realizing he was allowed to put it anywhere. "You are," he said slowly, "the most direct person I have ever met. You told me you didn't find it charming or aggravating." I was wrong. Something moved in her chest. "Which part were you wrong about?" she asked. He looked at her with the truest face she knew, the one that arrived in unguarded seconds and disappeared just as fast. But this time, it didn't disappear. "Both," he said. "I find it both." They were still in the music room when Mrs. Hargrove appeared in the doorway. Charlotte knew from the woman's face before she spoke that whatever she was carrying was not small. "Ma'am, Mr. Blackwood?" Mrs. Hargrove's voice was even, but her eyes were not. "Gerald Marsh is at the gate. He's not alone." Nathaniel stood immediately. "How many?" "3 men, and a woman." Mrs. Hargrove paused. "The woman gave her name as Suzanne Alcott." The name hit the room like a stone thrown through glass. Charlotte watched Nathaniel's face, watched the jaw tighten, the eyes go very still, the complete and rapid reassembly of every wall he had just, for the first time in years, allowed himself to lower. She stood. "Don't," she said. He looked at her. "Whatever you're about to put back up, don't." She crossed to him. "We handle this together, and we handle it from exactly where we are, not from wherever that look is trying to take you." He held her gaze. For 3 seconds, she was not sure which way it would go. Whether he would retreat behind the mask the way he always had, pull it down over the trueness of his face, and go to the door alone and carry this the way he had carried everything else. Then he said, "Together." "Together," she confirmed. They walked out of the music room side by side, for the first time since she had arrived at this house, as something that was no longer a transaction. Marsh was in the entrance hall by the time they descended. He had pushed into the house without invitation. Charlotte could tell by the rigid set of Mrs. Hargrove's spine, the controlled fury of a woman whose professional dignity had been violated. 2 men stood behind Marsh, and beside him, one step to his right, was Suzanne Alcott. She was striking, the kind of woman who knew she was striking and had learned to use it the way some people used a well-placed word. Her eyes went directly to Nathaniel and then, with a rapid, precise recalculation, to Charlotte. "Nathaniel." Her voice was warm in a way that was designed to exclude everyone else in the room. "It's been a long time." "It has," Nathaniel said. Cool, entirely controlled. "You're trespassing, Suzanne. You and Mr. Marsh." "We received news this morning about the survey," Marsh said, cutting in, his voice grinding and prepared. "Graves is not finished with this matter." "Graves filed for withdrawal this week," Charlotte said. "The matter is finished. You have no legal claim against this property." Marsh's eyes snapped to her. "Your husband's first wife is not present in this room," Charlotte said, "and her estate has no bearing on land boundary disputes that predate your arrangement with my father." She kept her voice level. "You've entered this house without permission to pursue a claim that has been legally dismissed. I'd like you to leave." "There are letters," Suzanne said. Everything in the entrance hall went completely still. She said it quietly, directed at Nathaniel, with the specific confidence of a woman who had been waiting to use that particular piece of information and had decided now was the moment. "Letters that Eliza wrote to my brother," she said. "Letters that describe this house, this marriage. Letters that describe you, Nathaniel, in ways that would be very interesting to the right people." She held his gaze. "I've held them for 3 years, out of respect." A pause that made the word respect into something entirely different. "But if your lawyers are going to pursue an aggressive posture regarding Gerald's claim—" "Bring them," Charlotte said. Suzanne turned to look at her. Charlotte held her gaze without flinching. "Whatever letters Eliza wrote to your brother," Charlotte said, "bring them. Publish them if you like. Put them in every parlor in Massachusetts." She kept her voice absolutely steady. "My husband was faithful. My husband was honorable. Whatever Eliza felt or wrote or chose, that reflects nothing on the man she left it to." She stepped forward 1 pace. "You have been holding those letters for 3 years because you believed they were leverage. They are not leverage. They are a dead woman's private pain, and using them to extort a land settlement from a man who has already been cleared by survey makes you exactly the kind of person those letters should stay well away from." Suzanne stared at her. Marsh stared at her. Even Nathaniel, she felt it just to her left, was completely still, in the specific way of someone who had stopped breathing for a moment. "You have nothing," Charlotte said. "Not legally, not morally. Leave this house." Marsh's face had gone dark red. "You can't." "She can." Nathaniel's voice came low and entirely final. "And she has." He looked at Marsh with the quiet, absolute authority of a man who has stopped managing his anger and started pointing it. "If I find you on this property again, I will not send a lawyer. I will come myself. That is the last time I will say it." The two men behind Marsh shifted. Marsh looked at Suzanne. Suzanne looked at Charlotte for one more long moment. And in that moment, something moved through her expression that wasn't quite defeat, more like recognition. The specific look of a woman who has just encountered something she hadn't accounted for and is revising her understanding of the situation. She turned and walked out. Marsh followed. The door closed. Mrs. Hargrove exhaled, one long, quiet breath that communicated several hundred words without using a single one. Charlotte stood in the entrance hall. Let the silence settle. Then Nathaniel's hand found hers. Not the careful press from before. Not the measured, controlled gesture of a man testing whether something was safe. His fingers closed around hers, firm and decided. The way a man holds something he has resolved not to drop again. She looked down at their joined hands, then up at his face. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know." "You did it anyway." "Yes." He looked at her face, all of it, the way she had felt him look at her sometimes in the early weeks and not understood, and understood now completely. The way a man looks when he is no longer cataloging, but simply seeing. "I told you in Prescott's office," she said quietly, "that I would become a capable partner. That was the honest version of what I agreed to." "That was the contract version," he said. "Yes." "What's the honest version?" he asked. She looked at him. "The honest version," she said, "is that somewhere between the survey documents and the music room, I stopped thinking of this as an arrangement." His hand tightened around hers. "Charlotte." His voice was low and entirely unmanaged, all the careful architecture of his control set to one side. "I should tell you something." "Tell me." "The morning I met you in Prescott's office, when you corrected the figure, $4,412. Something shifted in his face, something almost undone. I had been in that office 100 times. I had signed 100 documents, and I had never once sat across from someone and thought. He stopped. "Thought what?" she said. "That I was glad to be there." She looked at him. The man who had been cold and locked and haunted and careful and difficult, and underneath all of it, this exact, unguarded, honest thing standing in front of her, in the entrance hall of a house that was becoming, slowly, theirs. "Nathaniel," she said. "Yes." "You can say it." He looked at her for one more long moment. Then, "I love you." 3 words, quiet as the piano in an empty room, simple as a door opening. Charlotte felt them land in every part of her at once. "I know," she said. And then, because that wasn't enough, because this man had gone 3 years without being seen and deserved to be answered plainly, "I love you too." He pulled her forward by the hand and she came, without hesitation, without managing the moment or measuring its cost. And when he put his arms around her, it felt like something that had been waiting GK happen since the moment she had sat across from him in a lawyer's office and read every word of a contract, and looked up and said, "There's no clause here regarding children." She pressed her face into his shoulder. He held on. The summer deepened. Thomas Whitmore came to Blackwood Estate in August, hat in hand, looking thinner than Charlotte remembered, and older in the way men got old when guilt had been living with them a while. He sat in the parlor and told his daughter everything. The Marsh arrangement, the verbal agreement, the years of hope that it would somehow resolve without surfacing. Charlotte listened. She didn't rage. She didn't cry. She looked at her father, the way she had looked at him on the morning he told her she was being sold. Directly, without flinching. And then she said, "You should have told me." "I know. I would have found another way." "I know that too." His voice broke on it. "I was ashamed. And I was afraid that if you knew how badly I'd managed things, you'd think less of you." "Stop loving me," he said. Charlotte looked at him for a long moment. Then she reached across and put her hand on his. "I burned Mother's letters," she said, "before I came here. To protect them from a life I didn't know how to trust yet." She held his gaze. "I regret that more than anything you did, because I could have trusted the life. It turned out to be worth it." She paused. "Don't make me regret trusting you, too." Her father pressed his hand over hers and said nothing. Nathaniel sat in the chair across the room, where he had been silent through all of it. And when Charlotte glanced at him, he gave her the small nod, the wordless signal that said, "You're all right. We're all right. We're managing." She gave it back. In September, the music room stayed open. Not always, not every day. But the door was no longer locked, and the key was no longer kept. Charlotte learned the melody his mother had taught him, and played it badly for 2 weeks until it came clean. Nathaniel sat beside her on the bench and corrected her fingering with the patient precision of a man who had decided that teaching was worth the effort of care. "Again," he said, "I played it correctly." "You played it adequately." "Those are the same thing." "They are not remotely the same thing." She played it again, slower. He listened with his head inclined slightly, in the way he always did when he was paying close attention to something, and wanted it to know that he was. When she finished, he said nothing for a moment. Then, "That was better." She looked at him. "Was that a compliment?" "It was an observation." "Nathaniel." "It was a compliment," he said. "Don't make a ceremony of it." She laughed. It rang through the open door and out into the corridor and down through the house, and Della heard it in the kitchen and set down her ladle and stood very still for a moment. And Mrs. Hargrove heard it passing through the second-floor hallway and paused mid-step and closed her eyes briefly. And Margaret heard it from the east wing and simply smiled the way young people smile when they witness something they want to believe is possible. The coldest house in Massachusetts had been told it was cold for so long it had started to believe it. It had been wrong. On the last Sunday of September, Charlotte walked to the writing desk in her sitting room. Her sitting room, in her house, in a life that was hers now, in a way she had not let herself imagine when she was burning letters in her father's study. And she wrote to her mother. Not a letter her mother would receive. She knew that. She had known it since the morning she was 12 years old and stood beside a grave in the Massachusetts summer and understood that some things closed without permission. But she wrote it anyway. "I am telling you this so you know," she wrote. "The house is not what I expected. He is not what I expected. I burned your letters because I thought I was walking into a life I needed to protect them from. I was wrong. I walk through these rooms now, and I think of you often. The way you used to say that the people worth staying for were the ones who didn't ask you to be smaller. I found one. I didn't plan to. I arrived with a contract and accounted silence, and both hands holding everything I could carry. And somehow, without asking for it, without looking for it, I found a man who looked at what I was carrying and didn't ask me to put any of it down. He only stood closer. I think you would have liked him. I think he would have been afraid of you in the best possible way." She set down the pen, folded the letter, held it for a moment. Then she went downstairs, where Nathaniel was already in the parlor with his papers, and the particular quality of his settled silence. Not the empty silence of the early days, but the inhabited kind. The kind that existed because the room was full of something that didn't need to make noise. And she sat across from him. He looked up. "What are you holding?" he asked. "A letter to my mother." He looked at it, didn't ask. She set it on the table between them. He looked at her face, then at the letter, then back at her.
"Shall I leave you alone?" he asked.
"No," she said. "Stay." He stayed. Outside, September was doing what September always did in Massachusetts. The air sharpening, the light changing angle, the whole world preparing itself for something colder and quieter and necessary. The kind of shift that looked like ending and was actually a different kind of beginning. Charlotte Whitmore had arrived at this house with nothing but a signed name and a chest full of carefully held things. She left nothing behind. She only added to what she carried. A man's unguarded face. A melody learned slowly on an old piano. The sound of a door opening on its hinge for the first time in years. And the certainty, clean and unshakable as survey stone, that she had not been purchased. She had been found. And she had found him right back. And that, not the contract, not the settlement, not the $4,412 that had started all of it, was the only number that had ever truly mattered.